Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Let me welcome you to New York Law School. I'm Ross Sandler, Director of the Center for New York City Law and Professor of Law here at New York Law School, and I welcome you to New York Law School. It's warm in here. It's cold outside, as you noticed, but we're delighted that so many people came for this breakfast on a Friday morning. I do want to start on, a somber note that we lost a wonderful graduate of this law school and a really phenomenal city public servant in Kathleen Grimm this week, and I just wanted to acknowledge it. She would have been here. She was at all of our breakfasts, and any of you who've worked in the city met her because she was a phenomenon. Last position as Deputy Chancellor for 12 years. So we miss her, and we dedicate this breakfast to her. Yes. On the table is a short obituary for her. The Taxi and Limousine Commission is a newsworthy agency in the city government, and it has always been so. And I'm delighted to see so many people from so many parts of its regulatory world here today. Not that I know all of you. I spent 10 years on the commission, 3 times as acting chair, never as chair. But when I was there, the big issue is what do we do with those radios in the cars and those black cars. And then we had some other issues concerning criminality, which happily have not lasted. But today, there are amazingly important issues for the Taxi and Limousine Commission, much, in many ways, the most interesting, most revolutionary issues in the time that I have observed government, with so many changes and so many possibilities in a city itself that's demanding more and more transportation. So we thought it was fitting to have Meera Joshi here to speak and talk about the issues. She comes to the chairmanship of the TLC with vast experience. She was the general counsel of the agency, was instrumental in issues involving wheelchair access, the borough taxis, the various electronic changes that have been in the payment systems. She was right in the center of that. She was negotiating with lawyers and with industry people in her position as general counsel. Before that, she was an inspector general. She was also the the deputy executive director of the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board, which hears complaints about the police. So she's had a lot of experience dealing with very difficult, and maybe some of the most difficult city issues. So we're delighted to have her speak at this breakfast and to talk to this, I must say, educated and well-informed audience. Meera, I'll call you to the podium.
I do have a step up here. I haven't actually grown, but one day we'll grow up. So good morning, everyone. And I want to say a thank you to New York Law School and Dean Anthony Crowell, who's not here this morning, and the New York Law School professors who've been a great academic sounding board and resource to the TLC as we make our way through regulating in the era of dispatch apps. And a special thanks to Professor Ross Sandler for inviting me. I fully realize that hosting any taxi event is taxing, so I'm pleased that he rose to the challenge. And thanks to all of you for braving the cold and the early hour. And I apologize to those of you who may be disappointed not to see me wearing a little Indian dress. Contrary to statements made in the press, I don't often wear them, and they don't define my governance. And today I have very large shoes to fill. Preet Bharara is undeniably a difficult act to follow. On the heels of a historic public corruption arrest, his 3 men in a room speech roused the inner prosecutor in all of us who were fortunate enough to have heard it. But it's also a difficult act to follow for me as a taxi regulator in 2015. The world of taxi regulations is many shades of gray. The after effects of each and every policy change are complex. The number of perspectives to consider in any decision making seems ever increasing, and alliances change with every issue and sometimes mid-issue. So as regulator, I'm not charged with making the right decision because, frankly, there is no right decision. I'm charged with making the best decision. And sometimes I do long for the days of DOI and defined evidentiary standards. But arriving at the best decision is rewarding and far-reaching. At the end of the day, the best decision means residents and visitors are getting from one place to another safely and efficiently. And the structure that allows this to happen economically benefits drivers, vehicle owners, base owners, garage owners, and the city. In other words, the for-hire industry makes sense for all involved. And on a daily basis, I'm reminded of what Ross mentioned, that seemingly everyone loves to talk about taxis. Last year, between the News, the Post, and the Times, there were over 2,000 articles mentioning the word taxi. Keep in mind there are about 1 million riders a year. Compare that with 3,000 articles mentioning the word subway, which has ridership of over 6 million a year. So travelers, New Yorkers, are clearly disproportionately obsessed with taxis. So in thinking about what to dive into this morning, I did for a moment think I could get away with a short summary of our dense, complex, intertwining, beguiling regulations that have grown over time. When I started as general counsel, we shared a volume with DOT traffic regs. Today, we have our own, very own 700-page volume of rules. Compare that to 100 years ago. This is the 1915 taxi rule book. It's all of 10 pages. But to talk about our rules would be boring, really boring. Trust me, I wrote most of them. So if what people ask me is representative of what's on your mind, I figure that's a good place to start. So here's the most common comment I get. What about Uber? What is Uber? Uber, you must be busy, Uber. With a loud voice, what are you going to do about Uber? With a quiet voice, I tried it and I like it. So there's clearly confusion. What is Uber? Is it an app, a technology company, a car service, a transportation network? Is it legal? Is it a noun? Is it a verb? And what's it doing in New York City? What is Uber? It is the name of a company, and what that company and many other companies across the world are doing successfully is streamlining connections between cars for hire and passengers, allowing passengers to see their cars beyond their line of sight approaching, providing upfront information about the driver and sometimes about the fare, and allowing passengers to pay for service without ever having to reach for their wallet or purse. That is it. What does it mean for the for-hire industry? Generally, it means competition. And competition raises the bar for everyone. And there are tremendous market benefits for competition. More choices for passengers and a more mobile city, one less dependent on car ownership. But competition is only truly competition if it's fair. And for decades, different segments of the industry operated independently, and a unique set of rules developed for each one. The more popular the segment, the more rules were written to regulate it. So not surprisingly, yellow taxis are the most highly regulated sector. Fare, color, vehicle type, age, in-taxi payment equipment, shift durations. I could go on and on for about 700 pages. And while historically modes with less trip volume, the black car and the livery sectors operated with less restriction. Now apps that allow passengers to easily connect with drivers have popularized the black car and livery sectors, attracting new passengers and causing some taxi and livery passengers to patronize it. This change has called into question the unevenness of regulation, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing because it forces me as the regulator to focus on core standards that the open market doesn't adequately address. safety, accountability, accessibility. TLC regulations show instead a history of piecemeal rulemaking driven by a desire to correct industry-specific issues as they have arisen. The result is uneven regulation across segments on these core standards. So there is much work to be done, and in the last 10 months we've been productive. We've proposed and passed several across the board standards to address inequities in, among other areas, driver training, accountability, and app technology. For over the last 30 years, if you traveled by yellow taxi, your driver was trained in safety, in-vehicle technology, and streets knowledge. If you took a ride in a livery or black car, this would not be the case, for no threshold training requirement applied. The historic reason for this inequity was a perceived difference in passenger base. Black car corporate providers might provide their own training instead of tailored to their client base, and on the livery side, and in my view, a misinformed sense, that community car livery drivers, I guess, didn't need training to work in their own community. As the passenger base for these two sectors looks more and more similar and has grown, neither of these justifications makes sense. Today, there are over 70,000 FHV drivers transporting over 400,000 people a day. These passengers, like taxi passengers, deserve trained drivers. So last month, the Commission passed rules to make this happen. All FHV and all taxi drivers will be trained going forward, and training will reflect real priorities. Less focus on geography, everyone uses GPS, and instead, schools will train drivers on the safe use of it, and more focus on safe driving, as well as the tragic consequences of distracted driving and speeding. An emphasis on customer service and serving passengers who use wheelchairs, and providing clarity to drivers on their rights and responsibilities so they can better navigate the TLC adjudication process. Accountability. TLC rules require taxis and bases to keep records of all trips. Since at least 2009, for taxis, this has been done through in-vehicle equipment called TPAP, and green taxis are equipped with LPAP, which performs the same function. But on the FHV side, gathering information for enforcement purposes, for example, to identify a driver who may be the subject of a passenger complaint, or trip volumes and density for informing policy decisions, has been makeshift. For enforcement, the agency must reach out to the base and rely on the base's review of its own records, the completeness of which is not routinely checked, to provide specific trip information. And for policymaking, the agency has extrapolated from survey responses to draw conclusions about which areas are over and underserved and driver income. And since I began the TLC in 2011, the lack of certainty on the FHV side has been a sore subject. This culminated last year when it became apparent that FHV trip records were essential to account for drivers who, as independent contractors, have the freedom to work for multiple bases. And time was on our side. Though many bases still use pen and paper to keep track of trips, many more are using dispatch apps and can, with the push of a button, provide the data we need to effectively regulate. So effective December 31st of 2013, FHV bases are now required to provide electronic trip records to the TLC. The public rewards of this initiative are many. For example, as we do on the taxi side, we will be able to uniformly and regularly enforce against the use of suspended drivers in vehicles. And we will, for the first time, have a real picture of for-hire density and scarcity throughout the city, especially in the outer boroughs. And the industry itself will become more transparent to the public as experts who foil this data draw and publish their own independent observations. Technology. Apps that dispatch FHV cars have functioned outside the TLC's licensing process and making enforcement of core standards elusive. So we're halfway through the process of setting up a licensing structure that will set enforceable standards while simultaneously fostering further innovation and attracting new market entrants. By establishing baseline licensing requirements, passengers and drivers and bases will be able to choose from an array of vetted apps and have an avenue for redress if core standards are not met. Among other items, the licensing structure will address our rules to prevent distracted driving, to ensure access to accessible vehicles, and privacy and data security requirements. But these standards clearly are not the ceiling, so competition that drives better product development will continue to thrive. Going forward, we will continue to address inconsistencies in public contributions by sector. New York City provides the infrastructure, the amazing infrastructure that allows cultural institutions, businesses, retail, parks, libraries, schools, restaurants to thrive, and in turn creates an ever-growing in number and density pie of for-hire passengers. So each sector's contribution to support the New York City infrastructure should be relative to its trip volume. But today it is not. Notably, half of the over 1 million passengers a day pay 50 cents per trip towards the cost of running the city's public transportation system, but the other half do not. Half of over 1 million passengers a day pay 30 cents towards defraying the costs of putting accessible taxis into public service, while the fares generated from the other half of daily trips contribute nothing. So future policy will have to address these and many more inequities in support. Next, what does competition mean for the industry? Independent evolution. For years, our taxi regulatory standards, taxis met our regulatory standards and on the whole did not aspire to go beyond. Because ridership grew every year, our regulatory standards became more demanding. With relatively little competition, regulations were the main way to bring about improvements in service. Without TLCs pushing innovation forward, you may not have had the ability that you have today to get help tracking down lost property or to pay with a credit card in a taxi. And this paradigm worked for the most part for passengers and drivers. Amenities were added and drivers' protections were enacted and enforced. The overall end result is that there are many, many standards to meet to operate a New York City taxi. New entrants, however, do not look to our rules to create a business model. In fact, in most cases, they try to enter the market completely ignoring our rules. Notably, we're the only jurisdiction in the country that has required, without exception, adherence to our licensing structure if you want to operate for hire in New York City. Over the summer, Lyft unsuccessfully attempted to operate for hire without a TLC license. They now operate through a licensed black car base. And Uber, after losing their fight to withhold trip data, has now complied and is subject to ongoing data collection requirements. Nonetheless, once licensed, they certainly don't view our rules as the ceiling for service levels. Accurately, they focus on two main assets: attracting and retaining drivers and customer service. Not since the 1990s has the ability to attract and retain drivers so clearly been the key to success for taxi. But unlike the 1990s, when drivers left for better jobs, maybe with benefits in other sectors like construction, today's drivers are moving within the ever-expanding world of for-hire. Today, a successful for-hire business model is one that places high priority on driver compensation and provides support services necessary to become and remain licensed. Yes, money is important, but the more an operator can decrease drivers' daily stress, the more successful the partnership will be. This means that proactive owners are exploring ways to increase driver flexibility in scheduling shifts and rethinking dispatch practices, especially in light of the ease with which technology could allow drivers to seamlessly switch cars away from a garage and without ever physically exchanging keys. Additionally, assistance in completing TLC and DMV forms, such as pre-populating fields, providing a computer kiosk for online transactions. These are small but incredibly meaning ways garages can show appreciation for their drivers. Helping drivers gather the appropriate paperwork for renewals and initial applications, and tracking down missing documents, prepping drivers for exams, and providing older driver mentors for younger drivers. These all go a long way. Referral bonuses to current drivers for bringing in new drivers, longevity bonuses, and paying drivers as quickly as possible. Providing free representation to drivers for drivers who face DMV and TLC summonses and need assistance in navigating our adjudication process. Ensuring that cars are in superior condition and are pleasant for passengers. None of these are strictly required by our rules, but all are adaptations forward-thinking taxi and for-hire vehicle owners are already making. And as to customer service, despite all the talk of driverless taxis, the connection between the driver and the passenger is the secret to repeat patronage. And as additional options for travel open up, the lack of that connection can be devastating. For those models in which the driver's charisma and professionalism dictate the tip, not a preset formula, customer service is income. And in the taxi world especially, as we move into a more accessible taxi fleet, reinforcing wheelchair passenger training is vital to keeping drivers in wheelchair-accessible vehicles, the only way these vehicles will actually be available for public use. Only those owners and drivers who truly appreciate the incredible value of good customer service will thrive. For established black car bases and livery bases, in particular, competition means being a pioneer and introducing service to underserved areas. It means working together and leveraging the power of a consortium to achieve economies of scale. It means tailoring your service to your customer base to retain it and to expand it. Multilingual drivers, customer loyalty programs, flat rates, rewarding and recognizing safe and professional drivers. So in sum, Uber, Lyft, Get, Halo, Curb, Way to Ride, RideLink, Via, Bandwagon, and the many, many more that are here, and the even more yet to come, all represent just one thing, a new way of communication, nothing more, nothing less. But this new communication system has highlighted unevenness in our regulation regarding the adherence to core standards, and the TLC is now and will continue to address. And simultaneously, these apps are forcing the rest of the for-hire industry to evolve well beyond TLC's core standards, a boon for the entire city. The next question I get is, what about medallion values? What I find ironic is that the rhetoric around medallion values depends on their valuation. When medallion values hit an all-time high of 1.3 million in around April 2013, people described the owners, all 13,600 corporate and individual owners, as a cartel, a monopoly, litigious, and I won't disagree with that one, and even the taxi a-hole. Now that medallion values have come down about 25%, council members and members of the public ask me, what about the city's budget? Can we depend on auction funds for school lunches, for firehouses and libraries? And also, rightly so, people all of a sudden remember that over 5,700 of today's medallion owners are individuals restricted to owning only one and required to personally drive that vehicle for over a decade. Like our Safe Driver of the Year, Fred Amafu, they are small business owners, and they depend on the income and the asset to pay mortgages and kids' colleges. And any discussion on medallion values quickly turns back to topic one, Uber. Is Uber destroying medallion values? And here I think facts would actually be helpful. During the last 24 or more months, 8 of which the medallion values have decreased, a number of things have gone on, and some of them have made headlines, and some of them have not, and all of them affect medallion value. Green cabs. Today, there are about 50,000 trips a day done by green cabs. And although the majority of these trips are not taking place in areas generally served by yellow taxis, some of them are, such as Upper Manhattan and Brooklyn Heights. Apps clearly have had an effect on trip volume. And as we gather more and more trip data from FHV bases, we and the entire city will have a better picture of where they've been popular and when. Historic MTA ridership, almost 6 million riders a day, levels that haven't been seen since 1940 when there were more elevated lines and less car ownership. An accessibility mandate on yellow taxis. Many of the current models are not conducive to 24/7 life cycle, although the NV200 accessible may mitigate against that. Universal recognition that there was an artificial bubble in the medallion values. A few transactions at record high prices were not actually representative of the asset's value, followed by recent banking regulatory focus on lending practices relative to actual stream of income instead of heavy reliance on historic increases in aftermarket and auction sale prices. Frankly, a lesser market would be destroyed. The New York City yellow taxi market has instead taken a mild dip, and for those segments adapting through improved driver retention and customer service, rebounding is extremely doable. And in truth, for those who choose to instead rely on the TLC as setting the gold standard, instead of being it themselves, it is not. During this time of incredible change in the for-hire industry, yellow taxi trips have decreased about 25,000 a day. That's about a 5% decrease between 2013 and 2014. And the fare box has decreased by a little less than 3%. That's about $200,000 a day. And people still really, really, really like to hail a taxi in the street. And they do so at incredible volumes on a daily basis. Over 400,000 people a day hail a yellow taxi. And the good news is competition flushes out that part of the medallion price that was artificial and well above the upset price set by the city, and settles it at one that makes sense for lenders and for borrowers, and probably at a price point that opens up opportunities for drivers to be medallion owners and for new market entrants. So the focus should not be on what the price of the medallion is, but where it will stabilize. And that may mean some recent speculators lose, some early speculators still gain, and some will shrewdly wait it out to realize, cognizant that over the long term, even with economic transformation, the New York City yellow medallion has proven year after year to be a valuable asset. The last question I get is the crystal ball question. What will the for-hire industry look like in the future? And in answering that question, I don't look to other markets to predict what will happen here, primarily because we're always first, and more importantly, because we are unique. New York City is one of only a handful of places in the world, and the only place in the United States where you can 24/7, 365 days of the year, walk into the street and hand hail a car that has undergone a rigorous inspection, is driven by a vetted driver who's obligated to serve you. You can pay in cash or you can pay in credit. You can tip or not, but I don't recommend the latter. And you know exactly what the fare will be because it was arrived at through a public process, of which technically you could have been a part of, but I doubt any of you were. So New York City is and will remain a hail town, and the future of yellow and green taxi industry will be augmented by increased popularity of e-hail as new companies enter the e-hail market and passengers get the benefit of public taxi service at set prices at the tap of a button. And the taxi will become more of a brand that is marketed and advertised to customers. It will also be the most accessible fleet in the United States, providing long overdue mainstream service for passengers who use wheelchairs. And technology may even revolutionize the dispatch of vehicles, putting to rest decades of tensions between dispatchers and drivers. Tomorrow's passengers will benefit from an increase in service and an increase in tailored service in the livery and black car sectors as new twists on current dispatch technology caters to their every need. And tomorrow's passengers will enjoy an increase and more widespread legal commuter van service, what I like to think of as real ride share. Most importantly, all of New York will benefit. Competition has and will continue to elevate the standard of for-hire service in our city. Whether you choose to hail by hand or tap your smartphone, or God forbid, make a phone call, the level of service you receive tomorrow will be even higher than today because healthy competition will make it so. So I'm very excited about the years ahead, the possibilities for further improvement and new investors and new ways of investing in our for-hire industry. There are a lot of very, very smart business people in these industries, old and new, and some of whom are in this room today. And they all clearly have the ingenuity and fortitude, and I look forward to working with them to make this happen. So now that I've answered the questions that are on your mind, I'm sure you have none left for me.
Let me just make a few announcements. As you know, we'll do questions, but I wanted to make a few announcements. First, I wanted to thank our founding sponsors, Greenberg Traurig, the law firm here, and I see John Massolino here and others, Con Edison and Verizon, all who've been with us for many, many years. And then I also want to thank Wendell's Mark for their sponsorship of this, and also the Gold Star people. If you have a gold star on your name tag, that means that you voluntarily paid for the breakfast, and we thank you very much. We love our Gold Star attendees. I also want to thank the staff of New York Law School and the staff of the Center for New York City Law. These breakfasts take a lot of work. Brian Kasuba, Lillian Valley Santiago worked very hard to put this together, as well as the other staff of the law school. So now questions. The way we do it is you line up. So if you have a question, come right up, because we will end at 9:30 on the dot. So if you want to have a question or a comment, short but punchy, I hope, with a question mark at the end, then please line up on 2 microphones and we'll go side to side. Okay, Pat from Wendell's Marks.
Thanks, Ross. Pat Russo from Wendell's Marks. Good morning, Commissioner. In your comments, you spoke about the disparity in terms of the media attention to taxis. And as you alluded to, in the most recent months, there's been a discussion about the taxi medallion values. Specifically, the New York Times on page 1 and the New York Post and Daily News have reported that these values have declined because of apps. And apps have led to driver income decline, the ridership decline, and the exodus, if you will, of taxi drivers to the FHV side. I'm wondering, even at this point, from the data you've seen, and you alluded to, if you can comment on the accuracy of those reports, and if you could put your crystal ball on in terms of what the TLC can do with regard to the taxi medallion values of the future here in New York City.
I think it's important to note it's hard to value taxi medallions. It's a small market. There's not a high volume of transactions, and there's a limited number of players today. I don't know if that will change. I think it should, and I would hope that it would. So whenever you have a small insular market, valuation is difficult. Yes, there's been, and I went through a laundry list of things that have affected taxi ridership in New York City, but the world of for-hire is constantly changing, so that's a snapshot in time and not representative of the status quo forever. I do think that there will definitely be a decline, and there has already been a decline from 1.3 because there is some part of that asset that was artificially valued through bidding process, not necessarily through asset valuation and income. But as the taxi industry adapts, as it has always done in the past, to raising customer service and driver retention, I think you'll see the medallion value stabilize at something that's more representative of the stream of income and the asset's value over time.
Thank you.
I'm Phil Tugendreich from ET Partners. I have 2 brief questions. You can handle them together separately or not at all. But one is, do you know who Stanley Friedman is? And 2, why would you as a government official care at all about the value of medallions?
I mean, that's an interesting question, and I could defer to OMB, who's in attendance. But, you know, we as the taxi regulator, it should be an investment that makes sense for the lender and the borrower. But is there a magic number that the city cares about hitting? No, it doesn't, because you're exactly right. It's an asset that we auction, and the value of it is based on what the public decides it's worth. But people have come to, over time, and rightly or wrongly, depend on a value of the asset to translate into better city services. Now, is that accurate? Let's also put it in perspective. Medallion auction proceeds today represent, I think, 0.5% of the city's budget. So it's not a make it or break it situation. I think what we will see, and what I think is the best result, is a valuation that really represents how much money you can make operating a taxi.
Good morning, Commissioner. Thank you for your comments. I'm Juan Perez from Hybrid Media. As a Brooklyn resident and one who spends a lot of time in Southeast Queens and Flushing, you mentioned at the end of your comments the commuter van system, one that is particularly intriguing to me, being of that area. And I wanted to know what you felt was the future of that industry specific to technology.
I have high hopes for the commuter van industry, and I'm happy to see members of the industry here today, because I really do think, we spend a lot of time talking about how to get a black car, but, in terms of actual need, the areas that are served by commuter vans, I think, have a more sort of pressing need for for-hire service and quality for-hire service. We've taken a sort of four-prong approach to commuter vans, which I hope will elevate the level, the number of legally operating commuter vans in the city, and will also help those operators to use technology to better track their routes and their passenger, the number of passengers that they bring on board with each trip. We've worked with NYPD more closely than ever in the past to jointly enforce against illegal commuter vans, because taking an illegal van off the street is basically a mini riot every time we do it. Passengers are not happy if they're told they need to get off a van and find another way to get to work. We've worked on education, which is working with DOT, PD, community boards, and different council members on educating the public on the difference between a licensed and unlicensed commuter van. And I think the most visual change is we've added the NYC commuter decal. That's a voluntary program, but we've got hundreds and hundreds of commuter vans, licensed commuter vans, now bearing that decal, so they can look branded just like the New York City green taxi and the New York City yellow taxi, and easily let customers identify them as a legally vetted TLC licensed mode of transportation. So I think technology has a great role in commuter vans. You're organizing more passengers than in a single passenger delivery system of black car and taxi, so there's an even greater need to make that efficient.
Thank you.
Good morning. My issues have more to do with safety and accountability. I'm the mother of a 22-year-old college student that was killed in April by two taxis, hit by one, propelled into the northbound lanes, and run over by a second taxi. I am outraged by some of the basic safety issues that I feel are not being addressed and are being ignored. For instance, after my daughter Kelly Gordon was killed, the taxi drivers were given a basic breathalyzer test on the scene, and then they were allowed to leave with those vehicles that hit my daughter, basically with their blood on the car, the indentation of her body still on the hood, and they were able to leave the scene of the crime just like that evening. Technically, they could have probably driven around the corner and picked up another fare, as far as I know. I don't know that, but I find that to be outrageous and wrong, and I'd like to get your thoughts on that kind of an issue and what we can do to prevent that and have some more accountability, as well as a simple breathalyzer to me is just not enough. The drug problem is rampant, as we all know. Why weren't they taken to the hospital and tested for drugs? And then my third issue is with the vehicle itself. Why weren't those cars impounded? I understand 30% of the taxis fail inspection. Were the brakes working properly? No one knows. Those taxis were driven away. We don't know what happened to them. It should have been under investigation, And I think those drivers' licenses should have been suspended while that investigation was ongoing. I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
As to the vehicles themselves, I would have to defer to NYPD, but I do find it unusual. Their crash investigation squad is generally very thorough. They call us to the scene as well, and they gather all the evidence relevant to the investigation. And as well on the breathalyzer test, that again is NYPD policy. But I would highly encourage you to express those views to Commissioner Bratton, who is exceedingly open to public comment and can make changes where he can. As far as safety and what happens with drivers that are involved with crashes, there's been a change at the City Council level that has resulted in changes in our rules. And drivers, after the initial investigation by NYPD, after every crash, if there's any sign, preliminary sign, so that's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that's a preliminary sign that a driver was at fault or contributing to the crash, that driver is suspended and remains suspended until the investigation is resolved. Those laws and rules were not in place when your daughter was killed in that crash. And in part, unfortunately, her tragic death is part of what spurred the change in legislation and rulemaking. So things will be different today than they were when Kelly Gordon died, but until drivers, and we encourage and train and are encouraging fleets and bases to do the same, to really be conscious about their every move on the road, until that becomes the absolute, consistent way that people drive every day. And it's not just taxi drivers. They do tend to drive more than others, but it's every driver. Then we will have that fatal crashes such as the ones that killed your daughter.
Thank you. I appreciate your efforts.
May I just ask a follow-up? There was a death of very well-publicized Bob Simon with a livery, and the papers reported that the driver had ability only to use one arm. And so it raises the question, what kind of physical examinations does the TLC require of drivers? And can you give any information about that?
Sure. There's, first of all, the licensure requirement is a DMV licensure requirement. And so if a driver is licensed to drive by the state, then they are also meet the sort of driving threshold qualifications for us. Today, taxi drivers are required to submit a medical waiver saying that they're physically able to drive, and we are going to be extending that to FHV drivers who will also have to submit a medical waiver upon renewal and initial application showing that they're fit to drive.
Can you tell us anything more about that, the idea that a person could drive with only ability to use one arm?
Whether somebody's disability makes them unable to perform in a profession is, something that, one, they have to, if they can prove they can pass the DMV test, then it is difficult to second guess that and say that the disability actually prevents them from driving if they've passed the DMV test and now have a driver's license. On the DMV application forms, you reveal whether or not you have a disability, but if you've been otherwise qualified, the state and the city does not discriminate in issuing licenses.
Over here. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yes.
Hi, my name is Edith Prentice. I'm the chair of the Taxis for All campaign. I'd like to first query the concept of commuter vans, which are by definition inaccessible. It's very interesting that while we are making strides on the taxi for hire vehicle side, at the same time you are institutionalizing an inaccessible utilization stream. So that's very frustrating. And I've pointed that out waiting in your waiting room when I see the little sign, the big sign. But my question actually is about the taxi of tomorrow. The allegedly accessible taxi of tomorrow, which the community, the wheelchair community, has pretty much universally opposed between the rear entry, the single passenger space next to the driver, etc. We are dissatisfied with this, and we are dissatisfied with the institutionalization of that vehicle for the next 10 years. How does the TLC intend to continue the dialogue with the community when we are locked into this vehicle that we consider very inadequate?
I think locked is the wrong terminology. Under the rules that will be implemented on April 20th, the large majority of taxi owners that have to buy accessible vehicles will have to buy an NV200. And that in part was done because the city needed an assurance that we have a partner in accessibility. Today, auto manufacturers and converters that provide accessible vehicles could walk away from this market at any time. And in the past, we know even in traditional automobiles, they sometimes do. The Ford Crown Vic in 2011 was a determination that it was no longer going to be made, and the city had to scurry around to find alternative vehicles. So there is tremendous benefit to having a long-term partner committed to accessibility. But that doesn't mean there aren't options for other vehicles. In the green taxi market, there are no specifications. So any accessible vehicle that meets our standards can enter. And on the yellow taxi market, all the new medallions, all the existing accessible medallions, and approximately 500 of the additional existing medallions can be hacked up with any accessible vehicle. It doesn't need to be the NV200. So we're talking about close to 3,000 vehicles that do not have to be the NV200. That gives an opportunity for accessible vehicle manufacturers to come in and test the market and fine-tune their vehicles so that they meet the requirements of the accessible community as well as meet the life cycle requirements of operating a taxi. If in 5 years they prove to provide a superior vehicle, there is a clause in the contract that would allow them to challenge us using the NV200 accessible.
And the commuter vans, please?
The commuter vans, as you say, some are accessible, but very few are accessible. And like with they're not the only sector today that has an accessibility issue. I'd say that the yellow taxis are leading the way in accessibility, the green taxis are following, but the livery, black car, and commuter vans also remain woefully unavailable for accessibles. So in balancing need and improvement and accessibility, we have to first get everybody licensed and legal and operating, and then address the availability of accessible vehicles.
On this side.
Good morning. Michael O'Loughlin for Cab Riders United. I appreciated your thoughtful remarks and really appreciate your ongoing efforts to improve the safety and the quality of TLC-regulated industries. There are so many issues. Let's stick with the core one. My friend Lorraine raised a question about the safety of pedestrians and New Yorkers outside the vehicle. Let's talk about the safety of passengers inside the vehicle. For decades, medical professionals and others have raised concerns about the safety of the partition and sometimes additional items like credit card readers that are posted on top of the partition. In fact, I think one of your predecessors called the partition a gift to New York's plastic surgeons. Seatbelts. As Bob Simon's tragic death about 10 days ago reminded all of us, two things: speed kills and seatbelts save lives. So I guess my two questions are, now that we have one or two vehicles that have been designed and tested to show a safe partition, isn't it time that that's the standard for all partition vehicles in New York, yellow, green, otherwise? And seatbelts, in the era of Vision Zero, isn't it a no-brainer that we mandate seatbelt use in taxis?
On seatbelts, unfortunately, the state law does not mandate seatbelt use for taxis, for the drivers or the passengers. And that's part of Vision Zero Year 2, exploring ways that we can work to make the passenger and the driver safer in the vehicle. Because you're right, in the Bob Simon crash, there are two tremendous factors: speed and seatbelts. And if any one of them had been different, the outcome may have been different. And as far as the specifications for vehicles in other sectors, it'll be interesting whether. I think the real question is: are we going to move towards specifying vehicles in the green taxi sector, and would we extend that to the livery and the black car? or are you most interested in the green taxi?
No, I'm interested in partitioned vehicles and uniform safety standards throughout the city. I don't see why, if I hail a green taxi outside my home in Brooklyn, the safety standards should be any different than if I hail a yellow taxi outside my office in Manhattan.
Well, with the NV200 on the yellow taxi side, primarily most of the vehicles will be vehicles that have been crash tested with the partition installed. And we see more and more green taxis voluntarily are going to be purchasing, especially the accessible versions of the NV200. But it's something for the Commission to consider about whether something like the crash test rule, which requires every model to be crash tested with the partition installed, should be extended to the green taxis. And there are many liveries that, if they don't have a camera, they could have a partition in them, and maybe that should be extended to those as well.
We look forward to partnering with you on the seatbelt issue, and while it would require a change in state legislation to mandate seatbelt use, I'd encourage you to consider steps that the TLC, additional steps that the TLC can take to encourage the use of seatbelts, including maybe high visibility sleeves on seatbelts to make them more conspicuous in the vehicle.
Excellent. Thank you.
Let's go to this side.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioner. Jason Michelle from Windows Marks. I have a two-part question, excuse me, about accessibility. First is that presently there's a case out in California where Uber is being sued by the National Federation for the Blind. Uber drivers apparently have been ignoring pickups of people who have service dogs and charging them cancellation fees, and I think in one instance they even put a driver put a service dog in the trunk of the vehicle. And this is a big case that's going to be heard, I believe, on March 3rd. And in fact, the Department of Justice have submitted a statement of interest on behalf of the Obama administration, trying to hold Uber accountable to be a transportation company that is mandated to provide accessibility. So the first part of my question is whether or not the judge in that case rules that Uber is just an app and shouldn't, or is a transportation company and should. What is the TLC stance regarding holding Uber to the mandate of providing accessibility here in the city and other transportation network companies? And my second part, really quick.
Can we leave it right there because there are other people. So let's just take that question and
sure.
go on.
In New York City, black cars and liveries have to live under TLC rules, which have penalties for service refusals, including service refusals for passengers that have service animals. So any black car or livery driver or base that refuses service based on a disability will be penalized. And we've recently done an accessibility enforcement initiative, and it's clear 90% of our black car and livery bases are not providing accessible service. So there is work to be done on that area and that side. Is it a citywide accessible dispatch program, which is something that we'll hope to launch in, as we get through the procurement process, which will allow passengers throughout the city, instead of just in Manhattan, to connect with a wheelchair accessible taxi, and who pays for that service is another question we need to ponder. And do we also need to do more in terms of requiring actual accessible vehicles that are attached to a certain base? So yes, there are issues in terms of equity across sectors and accessibility that will be a lot of the work in 2015.
Great, thank you.
This side.
Good morning, James Barreiro, and I work with Elegante Consortium Transportation. And I wasn't going to ask, but when the gentleman behind you asked about the driver who got one arm and he was driving, I'm not driver, and I've been driving for more than 25 years and never have an accident. I don't know why a limitation can get into the picture when we have drivers that are hustling at the airports and we claim TLC to do something. They say it's a police NYPD issue. I would like to know if you guys work together like you work in other cases, because you go to Kennedy, LaGuardia, even in Newark is more efficient than that. I don't know why a limitation, physical limitation, gets into the picture when there is criminal records on 200 guys who get drunk, guys who use drugs, or hustling in places where they shouldn't. I would like you address.
Sure, and I thank you for coming today to speak forward on many of us suffer from disabilities, but that doesn't make us incapable of doing our jobs. So thank you. As far as hustling at the airports, we have a permanent JFK squad that's there 24/7. We're launching a LaGuardia squad that will be there as well, and they currently focus on people that are departing. They're coming to the airports and they're about to get on flights. And those people, those enforcement officers, seize cars that are illegally dropping off passengers. We've also started working with the Port Authority to be in the arrival terminal. So for the first time, we're arresting hustlers inside the arrival terminal. And to date, we've arrested over 35 people. Not only is their car seized, but they're actually arrested and get a record for engaging in hustling. Those efforts are ongoing and increasing, and we're hoping that the deterrence effect will have a great boon for the industry in terms of not having to compete with illegal operators.
I hope that goes on their record as when the gentleman behind you was asking, those guys who got limitations goes on the records and they are not allowed to drive. I'm really upset about that comment, and it's nothing personal. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're coming to the end, so the last two people who are standing will be asked the last questions.
Good morning, Commissioner Joshi. My name is Placida Robinson, and I'm one of your medallion licensees. Good morning. It's the combination of issues that concerns me together. The permission for the green cabs, the permission for the TNCs to come in, and a few other things, the combination of which could lower the medallion values. So what I'm thinking is the New York Post, Mike Gartland, has written the article disclosing that Bloomberg, the former mayor, has an investment company, Bloomberg LP, that invests in another company, Horowitz, that is a big chief investor in Uber and Lyft. And then, of course, about a year or two back, Bloomberg disclosed that he wanted to destroy the yellow medallion industry. And I bring that up because it scares me, not only as an independent medallion owner, but I get calls from fellow independent medallion owners that say this big combination of activities, what is the TLC doing about it? And to your point, for independent medallion owners, yes, we have to pay our bills. We've taken out massive loans, refinanced. And what does it mean for my daughter's wedding, college graduation? You know, I'm underwater, all that type of stuff. I'm petrified. So when you have public officials in office and out of office making statements like this, and then they're out of office and investing in these companies, my question to you is, as you probably publicly have read about this, what are you thinking or how are you strategizing when you have to deal with TNCs and you know that perhaps a public official whom you probably have had to take direction from when they were in office because you were at the agency, how are you dealing with that? What's your strategy there? Because it's a strange revolving door issue.
Good question.
That's what I have to ask.
So
Thank you.
I think a lot of my strategy I outlined in my speech.
Okay.
So, but I would also, comment that there's going to be a lot of external factors. I'm not sure that newspapers are the best source for investment advice, and really it comes down
investigation advice?
In determining how to value an asset, I'm not sure that New York Post headlines are probably the best way to make a decision. But I do think that it comes down to individual operation and taxis and green cabs working together to improve service. Because ultimately this comes down to how many passengers are going to get into your car every day. And that's where the focus is and should be.
This side.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Sarah Bacon. I'm with Bandwagon. We're a ride-sharing service currently at Newark International Airport and large events around the city. I wondered if you have considered incentivizing ride-sharing in taxis, in particular around shift change when there's such a high demand and limited supply.
It's good timing. We're coming up to April, which is our biannual lease cap and fair hearing season. And I know one of the topics this year will be how do we restructure our rules around shift change? Because, yes, there are lost rides during shift change, and it is a frustrating time for people to find a taxi. And I welcome you to partake in that process, which will begin in March and hopefully end before the summer starts. And looking at where group ride fits in and whether there need to be incentives are something we would definitely consider.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you. We'll conclude the question period. I want to thank Meera, Joshi, for a really very thorough, prepared talk that I thought covered a massive amount of material. And I also like to thank the questioners. I thought the questions were very apt and on point. I should also say that to the New York Post reporter that's here, we love the New York Post. Just don't take it personally. Our next breakfast will be April 10th, and the Speaker of the City Council will be here, Speaker Mark Viverito, and we invite you to that. And as we always do at these breakfasts, we like to present to our speaker a product of the scholarship of New York Law School, and with a little embarrassment, I present a book that I wrote along with David Schoenbrod. The reason why, it's a book called Democracy by Decree. It's about what happens to government when courts issue court orders against them. I thought, this really fits. There are lots of court orders. So with appreciation, thank you for a wonderful morning. We'll see you all at our next breakfast. Thank you.